Hi there, and welcome to Coup English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. Kurt Gödel, The Enigma of Logic and Infinity. Chapter 1. The Curious Boy from Brünn. Kurt Gödel was born on April 28, 1906, in the city of Brünn, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and is now known as Brno in the Czech Republic. His family was part of the German-speaking minority, and his parents belonged to the educated middle class. His father, Rudolf Godel, was a successful manager at a textile factory, and his mother, Marianne Godel, came from a cultured family with a strong appreciation for music and education. From a young age, Kurt showed signs of intense curiosity. His family lovingly called him Herr Werham, Mr. Y, because he constantly asked questions about everything around him. Why is the sky blue? Why do people get sick? Why do numbers follow certain rules? His hunger for answers never seemed to fade. Despite being a sickly child who often suffered from various illnesses, Kurt developed a sharp and active mind. He learned to read early and showed a remarkable memory. By the time he was in elementary school, he had already taught himself Latin and was reading advanced books in science and philosophy. His older brother, Rudolf Jr., later said that Kurt's childhood was marked by long periods of silent concentration, often spent studying books far beyond his age level. In school, Kurt was an excellent student, especially in mathematics. But unlike some children who shine only in numbers, he also excelled in languages, history, and theology. He had a deep interest in religion and would often spend hours thinking about the existence of God, the nature of the soul, and the possibility of an afterlife. This philosophical mindset stayed with him throughout his life. His teachers noticed that he was both gifted and sensitive. He was never aggressive or loud. Instead, he was thoughtful, quiet, and intense. He often preferred reading and thinking alone rather than playing with other children. His inner world was rich and complex, filled with abstract ideas and difficult questions that most people never considered. At home, his parents supported his intellectual development. His mother took him to lectures and concerts, while his father encouraged his interest in science and logic. Godel began to explore the works of great thinkers like Immanuel Kant and Isaac Newton. By the time he was a teenager, he was already thinking like a philosopher, trying to find deep connections between mathematics, science, and truth. The political environment of Austria-Hungary during Kurt's youth was unstable. World War I broke out in 1914 when Kurt was just 8 years old. The war brought fear, hunger, and social tension to many families. However, Kurt's family managed to remain financially stable during this time. Still, the war and its aftermath left a strong impression on him, and he became more cautious and anxious as a result. Some biographers believe that his mental health issues in later life may have had early roots in the emotional stress caused by the war. As he moved into adolescence, Godel's interests became more focused on mathematics. He entered the Real Gymnasium, a type of secondary school that emphasized science and mathematics. There, he encountered rigorous courses in geometry, algebra, and calculus. He quickly moved beyond the regular curriculum, often working on problems far ahead of his classmates. He was fascinated by the certainty of mathematics. For Godel, math was not just a tool, it was a path to absolute truth. One of the key turning points came during his high school years when he discovered Euclidean geometry and mathematical proofs. He was amazed by how a few simple axioms could lead to a vast world of logical consequences. This early exposure to axiomatic thinking would later influence his own revolutionary ideas in mathematical logic. By the time he graduated from secondary school in 1923, Kurt Gödel was not only a top student, but also a young man deeply committed to understanding the nature of truth, logic, and the universe. He applied to study at the University of Vienna, a place that would become the intellectual stage for the early part of his adult life and the birthplace of his most famous work. Though Godel was still a teenager, the foundations of his personality and genius were already in place. He was intellectually fearless, emotionally complex, and deeply interested in the most fundamental questions of existence. The curious boy from Biarinen was ready to enter the larger world of ideas. Chapter 2. The Vienna Years. Awakening the Logician. In 1924, Kurt Gödel enrolled at the University of Vienna. At first, he planned to study physics, inspired by the achievements of scientists like Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein. But something soon changed. As he took more courses in mathematics and logic, Gödel found himself drawn to questions that were even deeper than physics could answer. What are the foundations of mathematics? Can all mathematical truths be proven? What is the relationship between truth and provability? These were not simple questions, and they led Godel into the world of mathematical logic, a branch of mathematics that studies the nature of reasoning and proof. It was a field that few students dared to explore, but Godel was fearless when it came to difficult ideas. At the University of Vienna, he was surrounded by some of the most brilliant thinkers of the time. One of his key influences was Hans Hahn, a professor of mathematics and a member of the Vienna Circle, a group of philosophers, scientists, and mathematicians committed to logical analysis and scientific thought. Hahn recognized Gödel's extraordinary potential and encouraged him to study the work of David Hilbert and Bertrand Russell, two giants in the field of logic. The Vienna Circle played an important role in Gödel's development, although his relationship with it was complicated. The group promoted a philosophy known as logical positivism, which argued that only statements that could be verified through logic or science had meaning. Gödel attended many of their meetings, but remained a quiet and distant figure. His own views on mathematics and truth were far more philosophical and even metaphysical than the group's strict scientific ideals. By 1926, Gödel had shifted his focus entirely to mathematics. He completed his first major academic project under the supervision of Hans Hahn, and by 1929, he had earned his doctoral degree with a dissertation on the completeness of first-order logic. His thesis proved a major result. Every logically valid statement in first-order logic can be formally proven. This was a significant accomplishment and a major step forward in the study of formal systems. But Gödel's mind was already working on something even bigger. He had become fascinated with Hilbert's program, a grand effort led by the German mathematician David Hilbert to place all of mathematics on a solid logical foundation. Hilbert believed that mathematics could be reduced to a finite set of axioms, and that every mathematical truth could be proven from these axioms using a set of formal rules. This idea was not just about logic, it was about finding absolute certainty in mathematics. Gödel admired Hilbert but had serious doubts. He began to wonder whether Hilbert's dream of complete certainty was even possible. Could there be truths in mathematics that were true but unprovable? Was it possible that some statements could exist that no system of rules could ever fully capture? To answer these questions, Gödel began a long and careful investigation into formal systems. He read widely, not only in mathematics, but also in philosophy, particularly the works of Leibniz and Kant. He explored how statements could be encoded as numbers, a technique known as arithmetization. This approach allowed him to treat statements about logic using the tools of arithmetic. Gödel worked alone and in silence. He shared little of his thoughts with others, even his professors. Many of his peers thought he was quiet and withdrawn. But behind this calm exterior was a brilliant mind constructing one of the most revolutionary ideas in mathematical history. In 1930, Gödel presented his doctoral thesis and was awarded his degree. Shortly after, he stunned the academic world with a new and shocking result, his first incompleteness theorem. Presented at a conference in Königsberg in 1930 and formally published in 1931, Gödel's incompleteness theorem stated that in any consistent formal system that is rich enough to include basic arithmetic, there exist true statements that cannot be proven within the system. This was a seismic result. Gödel had shown that Hilbert's dream was impossible. Mathematics could not be made complete and consistent at the same time. There would always be truths that escaped proof, truths that were real but unreachable by logic alone. The reaction was immediate and powerful. Mathematicians and philosophers around the world were stunned. The very foundation of mathematical certainty had been shaken. Hilbert's program was, in a sense, defeated. Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and other great thinkers were forced to reconsider their positions. For Godel, the theorem was not a victory to be celebrated with pride. It was simply a discovery, a quiet unfolding of truth. He remained modest and calm, even as the world began to recognize him as a genius. Despite his growing fame, Godel continued to live simply in Vienna. He walked the streets in silence, thinking deeply. He kept a small circle of friends and often spoke with philosophers rather than mathematicians. He was particularly close to Moritz Schlick, one of the leaders of the Vienna Circle, until Schlick's tragic death in 1936. Godel's personal life was calm on the surface, but underneath, he was already beginning to experience emotional difficulties that would later affect his health. Through it all, one thing remained constant: his devotion to truth. Not just logical truth, but philosophical and even spiritual truth. Godel believed that truth was something real and eternal, existing beyond the limits of human knowledge or formal proof. By the end of the 1930s, Godel was no longer just a brilliant student from Vienna. He was a rising figure in the world of logic, a man who had changed the way we understand mathematics and truth. But greater challenges and deeper insights still lay ahead. Chapter 3: Princeton and the Company of Giants. In 1933, as Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, the political atmosphere in Central Europe grew increasingly dark. Although Godel was not Jewish, many of his colleagues and friends were. The rise of fascism threatened not only their safety, but the intellectual freedom that had once flourished in Vienna. The Vienna Circle itself began to fall apart. Some members emigrated, others, like Moritz Schlick, were silenced in tragic ways. Godel, though deeply private, could not remain untouched. By 1936, his health was deteriorating. He suffered from insomnia and frequent stomach problems, symptoms that many suspected were related to anxiety. A breakdown forced him into a sanatorium, where he remained for months. But even during these troubled times, his mind remained sharp. Letters reveal he continued thinking about formal logic and philosophical questions, often scribbling notes on scraps of paper during recovery. In 1938, the situation worsened. Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany in what became known as the Anschluss. Jewish professors were dismissed. Books were banned. Fear grew everywhere. Though Godel had managed to avoid politics most of his life, he now faced a difficult decision: stay and risk losing everything, or leave. Thanks to earlier contacts in the academic world, Godel had an invitation from Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, a place that was quickly becoming a sanctuary for Europe's greatest minds. There, he would join a remarkable group of thinkers, including John von Neumann, Hermann Weyl, and the legendary Albert Einstein. But getting to America wasn't easy. Godel and his lifelong companion, Adele Porkert, a nightclub dancer whom Godel deeply loved but whom his family disapproved of, planned their escape carefully. Instead of traveling directly west, they took a long and dangerous journey east, crossing Europe by train, then traveling through the Soviet Union, across Siberia to Japan, and finally by ship to San Francisco. It was a strange and roundabout path, but it got them to safety. In 1940, Godel arrived in Princeton. He was 34 years old. Though not yet well known to the public, he was already a legend among logicians. At the Institute for Advanced Study, he was given the freedom he needed. No teaching duties, no administrative obligations, just space to think. It was an ideal environment, and Godel used it well. But what truly shaped this period of his life was his unexpected friendship with Albert Einstein. At first glance, they could not have been more different. Einstein was warm, outgoing, and had a deep love of music and public life. Godel was shy, reserved, and lived almost entirely inside his mind. Yet the two became close companions. Nearly every day, they walked together from the institute to their homes, talking quietly in German about physics, philosophy, and the nature of time. Einstein once said that going to the institute was worthwhile only because it gave him the opportunity to walk home with Gödel. That's a remarkable statement, given Einstein's towering reputation. Their conversations were not casual. They spoke of deep things, whether time was real, whether free will could exist in a universe governed by laws, whether the human mind could ever truly grasp the infinite. Gödel, although trained in mathematics, was increasingly drawn toward metaphysical questions, believing that logic and mathematics pointed beyond the material world. It was during this time that Godel produced another astonishing result, his work on time and relativity. In 1949, for Einstein's 70th birthday, Gödel presented a paper titled An Example of a New Type of Cosmological Solution of Einstein's Field Equations of Gravitation. In this paper, Gödel showed that Einstein's equations allowed for the possibility of closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that could, in theory, allow one to travel back in time. This was not science fiction. Gödel's solution was based on real equations in general relativity. According to his model, a rotating universe could permit loops in time, meaning that one might return to a previous moment in one's own past. Einstein reportedly disliked the idea, not because Gödel was wrong, but because it opened doors to paradoxes and uncertainties that he found uncomfortable. Gödel, however, was serious. He believed that time itself might be an illusion, that the universe was timeless in a deep and mysterious sense. His views echoed those of ancient philosophers like Parmenides, who argued that all change was illusion and reality was eternal. But Gödel was not trying to unsettle people. He was simply following the truth wherever it led, whether in logic, mathematics, or physics. His aim was always the same: to understand the eternal structures behind reality. Despite these accomplishments, Gödel remained largely invisible to the outside world. He rarely attended conferences, avoided the spotlight, and spoke only when he had something profound to say. His appearance was unchanged, always neat, always reserved. He wore thick glasses, combed his hair carefully, and walked with quiet dignity. His only constant companion, aside from Einstein, was Adele. They married in 1938, and she supported him faithfully. Though she was not a scholar, Adele understood Gödel's delicate emotional state and helped him maintain a routine. She cooked for him, managed their home, and kept the outside world at bay. Gödel's emotional health, however, remained fragile. He feared being poisoned and often refused to eat food unless it was prepared by Adele. He worried about germs, disease, and the safety of his home. Though intellectually brilliant, he was deeply vulnerable. Still, the 1940s and early 1950s were among the most productive years of his life. He received growing recognition, including election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences. His ideas were reshaping not only logic, but also philosophy, computer science, and physics. To Gödel, though, these honors meant little. What mattered was the pursuit of truth. As the world moved toward the Cold War and a nuclear future, Gödel continued to work quietly at Princeton, writing, thinking, and walking with Einstein. He had escaped the collapse of European civilization, but the questions that haunted him, the limits of knowledge, the nature of time, the structure of reality, never left. In 1955, Einstein died. Gödel was devastated. One of the very few people who could match his intellectual intensity was gone. With Einstein's death, Gödel became even more isolated. But he continued, undeterred. In solitude, he pressed on into realms of thought that few others dared to explore. Chapter 4. The Silent Philosopher. After the death of Albert Einstein in 1955, Kurt Gödel entered a new and lonelier phase of his life. His daily walks were gone. The man who had once been his intellectual equal and closest friend had departed, leaving behind a void that no one else could fill. Gödel continued to live in Princeton and work at the Institute for Advanced Study, but he became even more withdrawn. He still published occasionally, but his attention shifted more and more toward philosophy, especially the ideas of Leibniz. the 17th century German polymath who had tried to develop a universal language of logic. Godel believed that rational structure was embedded deep within the universe and that human reason could, at least in principle, uncover it. He was convinced that there were eternal truths, mathematical, moral, and metaphysical, that existed independently of human thought. These beliefs put him at odds with many contemporary philosophers, especially those influenced by logical positivism and empiricism, who argued that only what could be measured and tested mattered. In his private notebooks and unpublished manuscripts, Godel developed a rich, complex, metaphysical system. He argued that concepts, not material objects, were the foundation of reality. He believed in a realm of objective ideas. Much like Plato's theory of forms, for Godel, mathematical entities were not inventions, but discoveries, real, eternal, and unchanging. One of his most ambitious ideas was his ontological proof of God's existence. Building on arguments first made by Anselm of Canterbury and later formalized by Leibniz, Godel created a rigorous, symbolic version of the argument using modal logic. In essence, he claimed that if it is even possible that a maximally great being exists, then such a being must exist in every possible world, including ours. Godel never published this proof during his lifetime. He shared it only with close colleagues, possibly out of fear that it would be misunderstood or ridiculed. But his belief in God was genuine. He saw mathematics as a reflection of a divine order, structured, perfect, and absolute. His ideas were not popular among many modern philosophers, who preferred empirical methods and scientific skepticism. But Godel didn't seek popularity. He sought truth, no matter how strange or isolated it made him. As his intellectual explorations deepened, Godel's health and mental condition became increasingly fragile. His paranoia grew worse. He believed people were trying to poison him. He became suspicious of doctors, hospitals, and even friends. He refused to eat unless Adele tasted the food first. When she became ill and was hospitalized in the mid-1970s, Godel stopped eating altogether. His fear of contamination, his need for control, and his philosophical perfectionism all combined into a kind of mental prison. It's tragic that a man so devoted to truth became trapped by fear. And yet, even during this decline, Godel's brilliance continued to shine. He received numerous honors. He was awarded the first Albert Einstein Award in 1951. In 1974, he was given the National Medal of Science, one of the highest scientific honors in the United States, but he declined to attend the White House ceremony. Colleagues and students remembered him as intensely precise in conversation. He disliked small talk and avoided public speaking, but in private, when discussing logic or philosophy, he became animated, sometimes even joyful. His soft voice would quicken, his eyes would light up, and he would explore ideas with incredible focus. Godel's home in Princeton remained a quiet, almost monastic place. Surrounded by books, notebooks, and years of handwritten reflections, he continued to think deeply about reality, time, God, and the mind. He was not trying to impress others or secure his reputation. His search was personal, even spiritual. He once said, "I don't believe in empirical science. I only believe in a priori truth." That sentence reveals much about him. To Godel, truth was not something you found with instruments or laboratories. It was something uncovered by reason and reflection. He also grew interested in the nature of the mind and consciousness. He disagreed with those who thought the human mind could be reduced to a machine. Godel believed that the mind had powers that no algorithm or computer could replicate. His incompleteness theorems themselves were often interpreted this way, as evidence that human understanding could not be fully captured by formal systems. This view inspired later thinkers like Roger Penrose, who argued that consciousness must involve non-computational processes. In this way, Godel's legacy extended beyond logic and mathematics into the very heart of debates about artificial intelligence and the nature of the soul. Yet, despite these profound insights, Godel's world grew smaller. By the late 1970s, he was rarely seen in public. He stopped attending lectures. Visitors were few. His letters became shorter, more cryptic. Adele remained by his side, caring for him when she could, but her health was also in decline. In his final years, Gödel became obsessed with purity, of thought, of body, of truth. But in seeking such purity, he isolated himself from nearly everyone. It was as if the very standards that had made him great now turned inward, crushing him under their weight. His last writings, scattered notes in German, philosophical fragments, and marginalia in books, suggest a man still wrestling with the infinite. He did not give up his search. Until the very end, he was trying to understand the structure of reality. In January 1978, Kurt Gödel died of self-starvation, weighing only about 65 pounds. Without Adele to prepare his meals, he refused to eat, convinced he would be poisoned. His death was not only a physical tragedy, but a philosophical one. The mind that had stretched beyond the boundaries of logic had finally collapsed into silence. He was buried in Princeton, not far from Einstein. The world barely noticed. There were no major headlines, no public mourning, and yet his influence had already begun to spread. Mathematicians, computer scientists, and philosophers would spend the next decades uncovering the depths of what Godel had discovered. His theorems, his proof techniques, his philosophical stance, these became foundational to many fields. Godel had walked alone, but he had changed the landscape forever. Chapter 5. Echoes of the Infinite. When Kurt Gödel died in 1978, the world did not immediately grasp the scale of his influence. But like a deep note resonating through a grand hall, the full effect of his work unfolded gradually, influencing generations of thinkers across disciplines. His ideas, some published, others scattered in notebooks, have continued to reshape the boundaries of human knowledge. At the center of his intellectual legacy stood the incompleteness theorems, which were not only mathematical statements, but philosophical landmarks. These theorems revealed that any formal system complex enough to describe arithmetic contains truths that cannot be proven within the system itself. In other words, there will always be truths beyond the reach of proof. This shook the mathematical world and altered the dream of finding a complete and consistent set of axioms for all of mathematics. The incompleteness theorems were not the end of Gödel's influence, they were the beginning. Influence on mathematics. In mathematics, Gödel's results clarified the limits of formalism. The early 20th century saw efforts to formalize all mathematics, driven by David Hilbert and others, in the hope of constructing an unshakable logical foundation. Gödel proved that this dream was ultimately unreachable. No matter how carefully a system was designed, it would always contain undecidable statements. Yet this revelation did not discourage mathematical work. On the contrary, it opened new avenues. Mathematicians began to explore relative consistency, model theory, and proof theory, often referencing Gödel's techniques and philosophical implications. The field of mathematical logic blossomed with new questions, many sparked directly by Gödel's insights. He also contributed to set theory with what's known as the constructible universe. In the 1930s, Gödel showed that the axiom of choice and the generalized continuum hypothesis were consistent with the standard axioms of set theory, assuming those axioms themselves were consistent. This moved the conversation forward in one of the most abstract branches of mathematics. A guide for computer science. In mathematics, Gödel's results clarified the limits of formalism. The early 20th century saw efforts to formalize all mathematics, driven by David Hilbert and others, in the hope of constructing an unshakable logical foundation. Gödel proved that this dream was ultimately unreachable. No matter how carefully a system was designed, it would always contain undecidable statements. Yet this revelation did not discourage mathematical work. On the contrary, it opened new avenues. Mathematicians began to explore relative consistency, model theory, and proof theory, often referencing Gödel's techniques and philosophical implications. The field of mathematical logic blossomed with new questions, many sparked directly by Gödel's insights. He also contributed to set theory with what's known as the constructible universe. In the 1930s, Gödel showed that the axiom of choice and the generalized continuum hypothesis were consistent with the standard axioms of set theory, assuming those axioms themselves were consistent. This moved the conversation forward in one of the most abstract branches of mathematics, a guide for computer science. Though Godel never worked directly in the field of computer science, his ideas laid some of its deepest foundations. When Alan Turing developed the concept of a theoretical computing machine, later called the Turing machine, he was, in part, answering the questions Gödel's work had raised. Turing formalized the idea of mechanical computation and showed that there were limits to what machines could decide. His famous halting problem, for instance, paralleled Gödel's unprovable truths. Just as there are statements that cannot be proven, there are programs that cannot be predicted to stop or run forever. Later, computability theory and complexity theory would trace their roots back to Gödel's logic. The idea that some problems are inherently undecidable or computationally intractable stems from the same soil Gödel cultivated. Interestingly, Gödel was skeptical of efforts to model the human mind as a machine. He believed that human understanding went beyond any algorithm, a view that has fueled debates in artificial intelligence to this day. Writers like Roger Penrose and philosophers like John Lucas used Gödel's theorems to argue that consciousness is non-mechanical, that the human mind has powers that formal systems cannot replicate. Impact on philosophy. Gödel's interest in philosophy was not superficial. He spent more and more time reading, annotating, and reflecting on the works of Plato, Kant, Leibniz, and Husserl. Though most of his philosophical writings remained unpublished, his private reflections reveal a thinker grappling with the fundamental nature of reality. Gödel believed in mathematical realism, the view that mathematical objects exist independently of human minds. He was deeply opposed to formalism and intuitionism, which treated math as a human invention or purely symbolic activity. To Gödel, numbers, functions, and sets were discovered, not created. This view aligned with his broader metaphysical beliefs that the universe is structured and rational, and that human reason is capable of glimpsing its eternal truths. His ontological proof for the existence of God was one of the most striking examples of his metaphysical thinking, using modal logic. Gödel formalized the classical argument that a maximally great being must exist if it is even possible for such a being to exist. Though controversial and difficult to interpret, the proof demonstrated his effort to unite rigorous logic with timeless philosophical questions. Philosophers today continue to discuss Gödel's ideas not only in logic but in metaphysics and the philosophy of mind. Some of his reflections on time, for instance, suggest that he believed time might be an illusion, an idea he derived from both physics and metaphysics. In letters, he hinted that reality might be better understood as a timeless block, where past, present, and future all coexist in a higher dimensional structure. A hidden giant. It is striking how much of Gödel's impact emerged after his death. Unlike some scientists who become public figures, Gödel remained hidden. His work was subtle, abstract, and often misunderstood by the general public, but among experts, his genius was increasingly recognized. Books, conferences, and entire fields of study have been devoted to understanding his theorems and their consequences. The Godel Prize, established in 1993, is one of the highest honors in theoretical computer science, awarded for outstanding papers in the field. At the same time, interest in Gödel's personal life has grown. Biographers and scholars have tried to piece together the puzzle of a man who changed the course of logic while battling deep psychological struggles. His friendship with Einstein, his reclusive habits, his strange death, all add to the mythos surrounding him. Gödel is often compared to historical figures like Isaac Newton, whose later life also turned toward mysticism and isolation. But unlike Newton, Gödel lived in a century where psychology and philosophy were no longer respected as much by the scientific mainstream. His late work was often ignored or dismissed, Only now is it being rediscovered. Legacy in the modern world. In today's world, where artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and the boundaries of logic are being tested daily, Godel's insights remain more relevant than ever. His theorems serve as a constant reminder that knowledge has limits, and that certainty is elusive. His life teaches us that intellectual brilliance often walks alongside fragility, and his ideas continue to inspire thinkers who believe, as he did, that truth is real and reason is our best guide to it. Kurt Gödel once wrote, "The world is rational, but we must be prepared to face the limits of our understanding." These words capture both his hope and his humility. He believed in the power of logic to reveal the secrets of the universe, but he also understood that some secrets would forever remain just out of reach. In the silence that followed his passing, his ideas have grown louder. They echo in classrooms, research labs, and philosophical debates around the world. He may have died alone, but his mind left a trail of light for others to follow. Chapter 6. The Silent Manuscripts. Kurt Gödel's mind never ceased to work, even when his body weakened and his social world grew small. In the decades following his most famous discoveries, he continued writing, reflecting, and exploring ideas, many of which were never published during his lifetime. Tucked away in notebooks, folders, and files, these writings formed a vast and mysterious archive of thought. What was hidden in those pages? What did Godel still hope to say? The posthumous discovery. After Godel's death in 1978, Princeton University and the Institute for Advanced Study faced a difficult task, managing the private papers of one of the most brilliant yet enigmatic thinkers of the 20th century. His notebooks, written in a precise, almost obsessively neat German script, contained a mix of formal logic, personal philosophy, metaphysics, and sketches of possible new theorems. The total archive consisted of over 15,000 pages, an enormous intellectual treasure, yet also a daunting puzzle. Much of it was unorganized. Some pages were clearly drafts of mathematical proofs. Others read like journal entries or notes to himself. They were reflections on time, God, the soul, the structure of the universe, and even entries pondering the existence of other dimensions. It became clear that Godel had never stopped thinking about the big questions. What is reality? What is truth? Can the mind understand itself? And, above all, is there something beyond logic that gives life its meaning? Scholars who studied these papers began to see a fuller portrait of Godel, not only the formal logician, but the metaphysical explorer. Unfinished projects. Among the most tantalizing items in the Godel archive are his unfinished works, projects that could have become major contributions, had he completed them, or found the courage to publish. One such effort was a project, often referred to as the Godel self, a theoretical framework attempting to describe human consciousness in logical terms. Godel had long been skeptical of the idea that the brain was simply a machine. He believed the mind had access to truths that no computer could ever reach. His goal seemed to be a kind of rational soul theory, combining logic with classical metaphysical ideas. Another area of deep interest was time. Building on Einstein's theory of relativity and his own 1949 paper on rotating universes, Godel continued to explore the possibility that time does not flow as we perceive it. He believed that the passage of time was an illusion, a feature of human consciousness rather than of physical reality. In his notes, he reflected repeatedly on the possibility that all moments of time coexist eternally, and that the universe was more like a static painting than a flowing river. He also tried to formalize ethics, using logic to define what it meant to act rightly or wrongly. These efforts were never brought to completion, but they show how wide his intellectual curiosity had grown. For Godel, logic was not confined to mathematics. It was a tool for understanding all of reality. A philosophical return. The 1980s and 1990s saw a renewed interest in Godel, not only as a logician, but as a philosopher. Thinkers began to explore how his ideas might intersect with Platonism, Kantian metaphysics, and even mystical traditions. Gödel's belief in mathematical realism, that mathematical objects exist independently of human thought, placed him in opposition to many of his contemporaries who favored constructivism or formalism. But his views gained new life as philosophers re-examined the ontological implications of mathematical truth. His ontological proof for the existence of God, once dismissed as eccentric, was translated into modern logical notation and analyzed by logicians like Dana Scott. While few philosophers accepted the proof as definitive, many admired its elegance and intellectual ambition. At the same time, Gödel's more speculative thoughts about souls, time, and infinity began to attract attention from interdisciplinary scholars, including those working in consciousness studies, metaphysics, and theoretical physics. Even theologians began to take interest, noting how Gödel's beliefs combined rigorous logic with spiritual depth. It was becoming increasingly clear that Gödel had not left behind a body of work, but rather a world of thought, as rich and mysterious as the cosmos itself. Gödel and the New Thinkers. New generations of scientists and philosophers have taken up Gödel's ideas in surprising ways. In quantum physics, some thinkers have proposed that the universe may indeed operate outside of linear time, aligning with Gödel's vision of a timeless block universe. In artificial intelligence, his incompleteness theorems are used to argue that machine cognition can never fully replicate human understanding, a point still debated today. Philosopher Roger Penrose, in his book The Emperor's New Mind, drew heavily on Gödel's theorems to argue that human consciousness is non-algorithmic, that there is something in the mind beyond computation. This idea, while controversial, has pushed discussions of AI and neuroscience into more thoughtful directions. Gödel's skepticism of mechanistic explanations was not reactionary, it was deeply reasoned. He believed that truth exceeds proof and that meaning exceeds measurement. In a world increasingly obsessed with algorithms, his quiet voice reminds us of the mysteries that remain untouched by machines. An eternal enigma. Despite all this renewed interest, Gödel remains an enigma. His fear of doctors, his silence in the face of fame, his extreme self-discipline, all speak of a man who sought control in a world he could never fully trust. He once wrote, "I don't believe in empirical science. I only believe in a priori truth." This statement, which might seem arrogant to some, was in fact a reflection of his deep faith in reason, not empirical measurement, but the inner clarity of logic and insight. Gödel's archive continues to be studied today as scholars slowly transcribe and interpret his writings. Each year, new papers and books emerge exploring his thoughts on everything from set theory to theology. His mind, like his theorems, contains more than can be revealed in one lifetime. He has become a kind of modern myth, not because of scandal or spectacle, but because his thought touched the edges of what can be known. A legacy still unfolding. It is rare that a human being reshapes our understanding of both what we know and how we know it. Gödel was one of those few. He showed us that truth cannot be fully captured by formal systems. He reminded us that logic, when pursued bravely, leads not only to answers, but to awe. His manuscripts, silent, dense, and filled with questions, remain an open invitation to explore. For every proof he completed, there were dozens he left unfinished. For every answer he gave, he uncovered greater mysteries. And for every step he took into the world of reason, he also reached toward the unknown. Chapter 7. Minds in Dialogue. Gödel and his Contemporaries. The 20th century was a golden age for intellectual giants. In the halls of universities, in letters exchanged between continents, and in long walks through Princeton neighborhoods, great minds met, clashed, and inspired one another. At the center of many of these quiet revolutions stood Kurt Gödel, silent, precise, yet profoundly influential. Though he was deeply private, Gödel engaged with some of the most celebrated thinkers of his time. These relationships, whether rooted in admiration, philosophical conflict, or mutual exploration, shaped his thinking and helped define the intellectual spirit of the century. A kindred spirit, Albert Einstein. Perhaps the most famous of Gödel's intellectual friendships was with Albert Einstein. In their later years, both men walked together almost daily on the grounds of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. For outsiders, these walks became a symbol, two of the greatest minds of the age strolling together in silence or deep conversation. Einstein once told a friend that he came to the Institute only for the privilege of walking home with Gödel. The two men shared more than genius. Both were immigrants from German-speaking countries. Both were suspicious of authoritarianism, and both believed deeply in the power of abstract thought to reveal deep truths about the universe. Yet their methods and personalities were quite different. Einstein was intuitive and imaginative, seeking unifying principles through bold thought experiments. Gödel, on the other hand, was methodical and introspective, building his ideas with meticulous care. Still, their discussions often touched on shared interests, time, reality, determinism, and the limits of scientific knowledge. Gödel once published a paper as a tribute to Einstein, presenting a solution to Einstein's field equations that allowed for time travel. Rotating universes where closed time loops made it theoretically possible to revisit the past. Einstein found the idea disturbing, but he deeply respected Gödel's ability to push the boundaries of what was logically and physically conceivable. Their friendship was not merely a meeting of minds, it was a meeting of souls. Two men who had seen the destruction of their homelands and sought solace in thought and friendship. Philosophical divide, Ludwig Wittgenstein. If Godel found kinship in Einstein, he found conflict in Ludwig Wittgenstein. Though they never met in person, their philosophical positions stood in stark contrast. Wittgenstein, one of the 20th century's most influential philosophers, had a shifting relationship with logic. His early work, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, aimed to define the limits of language and logic. He believed that much of what could be said meaningfully was already expressible through logical form. Gödel, on the other hand, believed that truth transcended language and logic systems. His incompleteness theorems were, in a way, a quiet refutation of the idea that logic could capture all truths. Gödel's results showed that no formal system can prove all true statements within its own structure, a philosophical earthquake. Wittgenstein reportedly dismissed Gödel's theorems in his later lectures, suggesting that they arose from misunderstandings about mathematical language. Gödel, in turn, believed Wittgenstein misunderstood the true depth of formal logic. Their divide was not simply technical, it was metaphysical. Wittgenstein believed that meaning arises from usage and that logic is a tool shaped by human practice. Godel, by contrast, believed in objective truth, existing independently of human minds, waiting to be discovered rather than invented. Despite their differences, both men reshaped the foundations of modern thought. Their intellectual tension reflects a broader philosophical debate between those who believe in constructivist meaning and those who hold two eternal truths. Logic and Legacy, Bertrand Russell. Gödel had great respect for Bertrand Russell, who was Principia Mathematica co-authored with Alfred North Whitehead, attempted to build all of mathematics from logical axioms. This monumental work inspired Gödel's early interest in the foundations of mathematics. However, Gödel's own discoveries would reveal the limitations of Russell's project. His incompleteness theorems showed that no consistent set of axioms could capture all mathematical truths, effectively ending the dream of a complete, logical foundation for mathematics that Russell had worked so hard to construct. Despite this, Gödel never viewed his work as a rejection of Russell's ambitions. Instead, he saw it as a refinement, a necessary next step in understanding the limits and power of logic. Russell, though shaken by the implications, reportedly admired Gödel's brilliance. Their relationship, though indirect, was part of a long intellectual conversation stretching across generations, a shared effort to understand the very structure of reason. A mirror in machines, Alan Turing. Another figure whose work intersected with Gödel's was Alan Turing, the British mathematician and codebreaker. Like Gödel, Turing explored the boundaries of computation and proof. In 1936, Turing published his groundbreaking paper on the Turing machine, which formalized the idea of an algorithm and laid the foundations for computer science. Turing's work complemented Gödel's theorems, while Gödel showed that some mathematical truths are undecidable within formal systems. Turing demonstrated that some problems are unsolvable by any algorithm, a concept now known as the halting problem. Godel recognized the importance of Turing's work and saw him as a kindred spirit. Both men believed in the deep connection between computation, logic, and the limits of formal reasoning. Yet Godel went further in his skepticism of machines. He believed that the human mind, unlike any computer, could access truths beyond algorithmic methods. Though Turing died young, and the two never met, their ideas continue to shape the philosophy of mind, artificial intelligence, and computational theory. An invisible network of minds. Through these relationships, Einstein, Wittgenstein, Russell, Turing, Gödel was part of a wider intellectual network. Though shy and withdrawn, his ideas were never isolated. They spoke to, and sometimes against, the most important thinkers of the age. These connections show us that Godel was not just a logician working in solitude, but a vital participant in the grand conversation of 20th century thought. His ideas continue to echo in disciplines ranging from computer science to metaphysics, from theology to quantum physics. He stood silently and precisely at the crossroads of logic and mystery. Legacy to dialogue. Today, students of philosophy and mathematics still study the debates and discussions between these minds. Courses in logic often begin with Russell and end with Godel. Discussions of consciousness often begin with Turing and circle back to Godel's insights. And anyone studying time or cosmology cannot avoid Godel's thought experiments and challenges to linear temporality. These dialogues, both real and imagined, continue to enrich our understanding of what it means to know. In the life of Kurt Gödel, we see that great ideas rarely emerge in isolation. Even the most solitary thinker exists in a web of influences, confrontations, and friendships. Gödel's story reminds us that the most profound truths often emerge between minds, in the invisible space where ideas meet, clash, and evolve. Chapter 8. Twilight of the Mind. Gödel's final years. The brilliance of Kurt Gödel's mind did not fade with time. Even as his health declined and the world around him grew smaller, his intellect remained razor-sharp, probing questions that had no easy answers. Yet, in his later years, the boundary between deep insight and overwhelming fear grew increasingly thin. The final chapter of Gödel's life is a study in contrast. Mental clarity alongside emotional fragility, philosophical conviction coupled with profound isolation. Retreat from the world. In the decades following his landmark discoveries, Gödel chose a life of increasing seclusion. After becoming a U.S. citizen in 1948, he remained at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, avoiding public lectures and declining most invitations to speak abroad. He did, however, continue to write and exchange letters with a small circle of trusted colleagues. Gödel had long suffered from episodes of illness and anxiety, but as the years progressed, his health concerns became more intense and more irrational. He experienced periods of extreme paranoia, believing at times that he was being poisoned or that enemies were trying to harm him. These fears, while unfounded, were very real to him. Despite his worsening mental health, his logical and philosophical work continued. He worked quietly on manuscripts concerning time, cosmology, and the nature of God. Many of these writings remained unpublished at the time of his death, and their full depth and implications are still being explored by scholars today. His retreat from society was not complete isolation. Gödel remained close to his wife, Adele, whose unwavering support had accompanied him since their early days in Vienna. She managed their home, shielded him from unnecessary stress, and stood between him and a world he increasingly distrusted. Their bond was one of deep affection, though Gödel's obsessions made life difficult for them both. faith and the infinite. During these final decades, Godel's interest in metaphysical and theological questions became even more pronounced. He read widely in theology, philosophy, and ancient texts, seeking a comprehensive view of reality that included both the rational and the transcendent. One of his most intriguing private works was an ontological proof for the existence of God, inspired by the ideas of 17th-century philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Godel reformulated Leibniz's argument using modern modal logic, asserting that the existence of a supreme being was not only conceivable, but logically necessary. Godel never intended this proof to be a matter of religious propaganda. He viewed it as an exercise in formal reasoning, showing that even metaphysical concepts could be treated with rigorous logic. Still, it revealed something deeply personal, his belief in objective truth, moral order, and a universe with meaning beyond the observable. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Godel did not separate science from spirituality. He believed that mathematics pointed toward a higher realm of reality, one that transcended time and space, and that the human mind could, if only briefly, glimpse eternal truths. This vision sustained him even as his fears grew darker. Illness of the body, clarity of the mind. By the late 1970s, Godel's health had worsened dramatically. He became increasingly dependent on Adele, not just for companionship, but for survival. His fear of being poisoned became so intense that he refused to eat food prepared by anyone other than his wife. When Adele herself fell seriously ill and had to be hospitalized for several weeks, Godel's world collapsed. Left without anyone he trusted to prepare his meals, he refused to eat altogether. Despite efforts by friends and medical professionals, he would not be convinced otherwise. This tragic end seemed almost unthinkable for a man of such intellectual stature. On January 14, 1978, Kurt Gödel died of starvation, weighing only 65 pounds 29 kilograms. The official cause was listed as malnutrition and inanition, compounded by personality disturbance. He was 71 years old. Aftermath and legacy. Gödel's death shocked the academic community. Those who had admired his work were devastated to learn how privately he had suffered. Yet even in mourning, many began to reflect more deeply on his life's work, not just the famous theorems, but the broader philosophical worldview he had constructed. The manuscripts and notes Godel left behind have become a treasure trove for researchers. Over time, scholars have explored his unpublished writings on the nature of the mind, cosmology, mathematics, and theology. Slowly, a more complete picture has emerged, not just of Godel the logician, but of Godel, the philosopher, the seeker, the man who wrestled with the deepest questions of existence. His grave lies in Princeton, not far from the institute where he spent most of his life. There, in quiet remembrance, one can reflect on the strange path of a man who revealed the limits of reason and yet lived by its laws to the end. A gentle voice, a profound silence. Godel was not a revolutionary in the usual sense. He did not lead movements or challenge institutions with fiery rhetoric. He worked in silence, with pen and paper, pursuing abstract patterns that most of us can only glimpse. And yet, his work changed everything. By showing that mathematical truth extends beyond formal proof, he opened the door to questions about what we can know, how we can know it, and whether the mind is more than a machine. His life ended quietly, even tragically, but his voice continues in equations, in philosophy classrooms, in books about logic, and in the quiet awe of those who encounter his theorems for the first time. To read Godel is to step into a world where truth is vast, mysterious, and ultimately unreachable in full, and to find in that incompleteness, not defeat, but wonder. Chapter 9. Godel's Echo, Legacy, Interpretation, and the Debate over the Mind. Kurt Gödel's physical voice fell silent in 1978, but the resonance of his work has only grown louder with time. His theorems have inspired not only generations of logicians and mathematicians, but also philosophers, cognitive scientists, computer theorists, and theologians. Godel's name once quietly associated with abstract logic, has become a symbol of the depths and boundaries of human understanding. This chapter traces how Gödel's legacy has unfolded since his death, and how his ideas have become battlegrounds in debates about the nature of mind, truth, and even the future of machine intelligence. Philosophical reverberations. At the heart of Gödel's influence is his incompleteness theorem, which declared that within any sufficiently powerful formal mathematical system, there are true statements that cannot be proven within that system. This was not just a technical result, it was a philosophical shockwave. It shook the foundations of formalism, the belief that all mathematical truths could be derived from a fixed set of axioms. For philosophers, Gödel's result introduced a profound epistemological question. If there are truths that cannot be proven, how do we know them? What is the source of our mathematical intuition? The British philosopher Michael Dumit, and later Roger Penrose, took this question further. Penrose, a mathematical physicist, famously argued in his books, "The Emperor's New Mind and Shadows of the Mind," that Gödel's theorem implies that the human mind is not a mere algorithm. According to Penrose, if the mind were equivalent to a computer running a formal system, it would be unable to perceive certain truths, yet humans can. This claim sparked heated debate. Some saw it as a powerful argument for the uniqueness of human consciousness. Others criticized it as a misinterpretation of Gödel's result. Nevertheless, Gödel had unwittingly become central to the philosophy of mind and the debate over artificial intelligence. Gödel and the rise of AI. In the latter half of the 20th century, as computer science advanced, Gödel's name began to appear in unlikely places. Papers on machine learning, neural networks, and the nature of consciousness. Some AI theorists took Gödel's results as a challenge to the idea of strong AI, the belief that machines can fully replicate human cognition. If Gödel was right, and human minds can see the truth of certain unprovable statements, then minds might do more than compute. Others, however, took a more modest view. They argued that Gödel's theorem merely showed the limitations of formal systems, not of all possible computational systems. Perhaps a sufficiently flexible machine could adapt or reconfigure its axioms, expanding its scope. After all, Gödel's proof applies only within a fixed system. The argument continues to this day, but the fact that a proof written in 1931 still plays such a central role in modern discussions of consciousness and AI speaks volumes about Gödel's enduring significance. Mathematics, Platonism, and the infinite. One of Gödel's most passionately held beliefs was that mathematical objects are real, existing independently of human thought. This view, known as Platonism, contrasts with the idea that mathematics is simply a human invention, a set of useful symbols and rules. Gödel believed we discover mathematical truths in the same way that astronomers discover stars, or biologists discover new species. They are out there, waiting to be seen. For Gödel, intuition, the mind's ability to see these truths, was as real and valid as sense perception. His Platonism placed him at odds with the dominant philosophies of his time, especially formalism and constructivism, which treated mathematics as a human-constructed game with rules. Gödel, however, insisted that mathematical truth transcends language, culture, and even logic itself. After his death, this position gained both admirers and critics. Some praised Gödel for defending the objective reality of abstract thought, while others saw his ideas as mystical and unscientific. Still, his stance has prompted ongoing re-examinations of what mathematics actually is: a tool, a language, or a window into a deeper realm. Unpublished works and new discoveries. Gödel left behind boxes of unpublished notes, many handwritten in German and filled with cryptic symbols, marginalia, and philosophical musings. Since the 1980s, scholars have slowly catalogued and interpreted these materials, uncovering a broader scope to Gödel's intellectual life. Among the topics Gödel explored: the structure of time and the possibility of time travel, logical models for cosmology and the rotating universe, reinterpretations of Leibniz's metaphysics, notes on Kant, Husserl, and phenomenology, the construction of an objective ethics based on mathematical principles. These writings show that Godel was not simply a logician, but a wide-ranging thinker, trying to synthesize science, philosophy, and spirituality into a coherent worldview. Even today, new doctoral theses and academic papers are still being written about Gödel's posthumous papers. His ideas continue to provoke curiosity and intellectual adventure. Godel among giants. In the decades since his death, Godel has come to be ranked among the intellectual giants of the 20th century. He is often placed beside Einstein, with whom he shared not only an institute, but a deep respect for reality's hidden order. His image, slender, reserved, introspective, has become a symbol of the pure thinker, untouched by fashion or fame. He rarely sought the spotlight, yet his name now stands in the constellation of the greats, alongside Cantor, Hilbert, Turin, and Russell. In schools, his incompleteness theorem is taught as a cornerstone of modern logic. In philosophy departments, his challenge to formalism is a key topic of debate. In computer science, his work is foundational, and in spiritual or metaphysical circles, his search for ultimate meaning has inspired new interpretations of logic itself. A living question. Perhaps the greatest legacy Godel left is not a final answer, but a question, a living, breathing question about the limits of what we can prove, know, or explain. What happens when logic itself says, "Here, I can go no further"? Is that the edge of truth, or the threshold of something deeper? Godel did not offer certainty, but he redefined the landscape. He taught us that incompleteness is not failure, but part of the structure of knowledge. That mystery is not ignorance, but a clue to something more profound, and that even the most brilliant minds must live with uncertainty. Chapter 10. A Silent Oracle. The final portrait of Kurt Gödel. Kurt Gödel lived a life that often seemed out of step with the world around him, while nations shifted and wars raged, while ideologies rose and fell. He remained focused on something silent and eternal, truth. His life ended in solitude, but his ideas continue to speak. In the hush of academic halls, in philosophical debates, in computer labs filled with glowing monitors, his theorems whisper their paradoxes. In that silence, Godel became an oracle, not of answers, but of limits, questions, and hidden realities. The solitary visionary. Gödel's story is not one of public triumphs or political causes. He never led a movement, never gave grand speeches, and never sought fame. His strength came from within, from an inner world so rich, so precise, and so demanding that it often left him isolated. He once said, "I don't believe in empirical science. I only believe in a priori truth." This view placed him in a tradition older than modern science, a tradition of Plato, Descartes, and Leibniz, thinkers who believed that the mind could access truths not by measurement, but by insight. That belief shaped every aspect of Gödel's life. He did not try to master the physical world. Instead, he explored a different universe, a mathematical and logical realm where beauty, certainty, and eternity still existed. Yet this journey came with a cost. His mind, which so easily roamed abstract spaces, was vulnerable in the everyday world. Anxiety, paranoia, and a deep mistrust of the body's physicality led him into self-imposed confinement. He feared being poisoned. He refused to eat unless his wife prepared the food. When she was hospitalized, he starved himself. In January 1978, he died weighing just 65 pounds. The man who had once expanded the limits of logic had, in his final days, collapsed inward, trapped by fears even logic could not undo. Legacy beyond mathematics. Despite, or perhaps because of, his private struggles, Gödel's legacy is immense. In mathematics, his incompleteness theorems reshaped the field forever. No longer could logicians chase the dream of a complete, self-contained system. They had to reckon with the essential incompleteness of truth. But his legacy reached far beyond numbers and symbols. In philosophy, Gödel revived interest in rational metaphysics, insisting that truth was not just empirical, but discoverable through pure thought. He forced a new generation to take seriously the idea of a non-empirical reality, a domain of abstract forms, principles, and ideals. In physics, he dared to suggest that time might be an illusion and that our understanding of the cosmos was still incomplete. In computer science, his theorems laid the groundwork for our modern understanding of what can and cannot be computed, influencing minds like Turing, Chatan, and beyond. In metaphysics, his unpublished ontological proof for God's existence raised eyebrows and questions, not because it was proof in the usual sense, but because Godel, the greatest logician of his time, believed that logic itself pointed beyond logic toward something transcendent. A human enigma. Kurt Gödel defies easy categorization. He was a man of logic who believed in angels, a thinker obsessed with rigor who feared irrational threats, a recluse who longed for lasting meaning. A friend of Einstein who outlived him by decades, yet seemed to vanish with him. His contradictions do not cancel each other out. They deepen his mystery. He lived in the shadow of giants, but created a shadow of his own. Students study him, not merely for what he wrote, but for what he represents. The cost of thinking deeply, the price of uncompromising pursuit, the loneliness of genius. To some, he is a tragic figure. To others, a saint of reason. To many, a warning that the mind's light, if not balanced by the heart's warmth, can become too bright to bear. The sound of incompleteness. Godel did not believe in finishing things. He left many of his thoughts unwritten, many of his insights unspoken. Perhaps that too was part of his message. We live in a world that prizes closure, solutions, and answers, but Godel showed us that some truths cannot be boxed, explained, or proven. Some truths, like the self itself, exist only beyond the edge of reason. And yet he did not despair. His theorems are not cries of defeat, but hymns to the infinite. They are evidence that there is more to know, more to seek, more to wonder. That wonder is Godel's gift to us. A life measured in thought. There are no statues of Kurt Gödel in city squares. His face does not grace currency or posters, but in classrooms, in libraries, in quiet moments of reflection, his influence is felt. He taught us that truth is not always visible, that logic is not always enough, and that the journey of the mind, though lonely, is also luminous. His life reminds us that some people are born not to follow the world, but to look beyond it.